Now, before going into detail, at first we must understand what diversification strategy actually means for any particular business firm. Now, any business firm, this diversification strategy is basically a risk mitigation strategy in which a firm tries to spread its operation across various activities having different outcomes. Now, if a firm is investing in any particular activity or it's investing its entire fund in any particular venture, then there is a high risk that the firm will incur loss. But if it is investing in different alternative ventures, then the loss incurred in one particular activity can be compensated by the gains that it can make from other activities. So as a result, this diversification is actually reduces the chance of getting the risk of failure. Sometimes we call that the firm should not put all the eggs in one basket, because if one egg is rotten, then it is a high chance that other eggs in the same basket will also get rotten. Now, for this diversification strategy for any particular business firm, it needs some search of some new markets or some different product lines, not only to reap the benefits of economies of scale or economies of scope, but also to infuse a sort of synergic effect that can promote the corporate growth. Now, this is all about the diversification strategy for a particular business firm. Now, if we try to understand in a macro sense why the national government, they actually goes for this diversification strategy, and particularly in this case, the diversification of industries, then there must be some important objectives. Now, the first important objective behind this diversification strategy for the national government, particularly in case of some emerging markets, is that the diversification promotes sustained economic growth of any particular nation. Secondly, there are many industries, many domestic industries in a particular nation that has the potential to thrive if it can get adequate support from the government with the help of local resources, local talents, and local conditions. So by promoting those industries, government can bring forward many industries in forefront with this diversification strategy. The third important objective of the government is obviously employment generation. And this objective is very critical, particularly for the developing nations like India, where it can reduce poverty and obviously income inequality. Now, diversification can also modernize the economy in terms of venturing upon those business prospects which have much market demand and that is subject to the changing consumer demands. Fifthly, this diversification strategy can also help the nation to achieve self-sufficiency. Now, with a sort of this diversification strategy, particularly with the import competing sector, the firm, this diversification strategy will actually reduce the import content of the firm, and thereby the foreign exchange that the nation can save, it can actually correct the adverse balance of payment situation of the nation as well. And finally, this diversification strategy can also help the nation to earn much more foreign exchange in terms of diversification of the export basket and putting the national talents on international platforms. But one should understand it properly that for successful diversification strategy, two conditions are very critical. The first condition is that to identify the potential industries that can thrive with the proper government support. So, the identification of these potential industries is the first critical factor that should be taken into account. And the second important factor is that implementation of the proper policies on the part of the government that can not only help to develop the necessary infrastructure, but also to develop the skill sets required for the workers to compete in a global environment. Now, the learning objective of this particular course is that at first we should try to understand what was the industrial situation of India at the time of independence. Secondly, we should understand how this industrial structure has diversified over time since the time of inception with the structural transformation of the economy as well as the changing demand pattern. And finally, how the government policies have been instrumental in promoting a diversified industrial structure. Now, before the Industrial Revolution and advent of the modern industries, Indian manufacturer had a global market, accounting for almost one-fourth of the global manufacturing output. And at that time, the major export items of India was the cotton and silk fabrics, woolen garments, there were spices and artistic wares. But while India, under the British rule, the imperialistic policy of the British government, as well as the policy of discriminating protection, actually lead to deindustrialization of Indian handicrafts once upon a time, which was the pride of the nation. But despite those imperialistic policies, some industries actually got some progress. For example, cotton textile, sugar, cement, matches, and to some extent iron and steel. However, due to the colonial legacy, the industrial structure of the economy was very much underdeveloped at the time of independence. Now, the consumer goods industries predominated, but there was a very lack of capital goods industries and basic good industries at the time of independence. Moreover, the productive capacity of the intermediate good industries, they were also fall short of their productive capacity. And the overall industrial structure was characterized by dearth of capital, there was infrastructural bottlenecks, and acute deficiency in the technical and managerial skills. Now, at that time, the ownership pattern in the industries were very much concentrated and export basket lacked the industrial goods. Now, after independence, the first industrial policy resolution was implemented in 1948. And that was actually put the roadmap for the India's industrial development in that particular policy resolution. Now, as we already mentioned, that at the time of independence, there was acute shortage of the basic and capital goods industries in the nation. So the first industrial policy resolution of 1948 put special emphasis on the development of basic and capital goods industries instead of consumer goods industries. It was thought at that time that if the consumer goods industries are being developed, then very soon it will suffer from a sort of problem regarding infrastructural bottlenecks. So after preparing the infrastructure properly, the consumer goods industries can thrive. So as a result, more stress was given on basic and capital goods industries. Immediately after independence, the first industrial policy resolution was implemented in the year 1948, and that actually outlined the progress of industrial development of the nation. Now, as we already mentioned, that during the time of independence, the consumer goods sectors were actually predominated, and there was very lack of basic and capital goods industries in the nation. So in the 1948 industrial resolution, that put special emphasis on the development of basic and capital goods industries, particularly in like iron and steel, heavy engineering, machine building, and necessary infrastructure, as well as priority was also given for increase in the production capacity of the industries like aluminium, cement, fertilizers, some essential drugs, and some of the consumer goods. Now, basically, the basic and capital goods industries were given special focus instead of consumer goods industries on the basis of the fact that it was believed that if the consumer goods industries are being given the focus, then its growth will be halted soon in near future because of the infrastructural constraints. So that's why the basic and capital goods industries were given the special focus. Now, the basic problem is that investment in those types of industries require huge amount of capital. Moreover, these projects have a long gestation period. So obviously, the private firms will not show much interest in investing in these types of projects. So government has to come forward to take the initiative of building up those industries. As a result, in the 1956 industrial policy, it was given the public sector was given the predominant role not only to develop these industries but also to elevate them into the commanding heights of the economy. Now, we are talking about the period of time in 1950s and 1960s. Some important developments were also going on around the world economy, and that have significant impact on the domestic industrial policy formulation as well. Now, this is the time where an export pessimism philosophy influenced the world economy. Now, there was some center periphery theory of Previs Singer and followed by the backwash effects of Midrell, then Baran and Frank. All of them actually tried to focus on the fact that if the less developed nations are actually trying to go for free trade with the developed nations of the world, then all the gains goes to the developed nations and less developed nations will actually suffer from loss. According to the Previs Singer doctrine, if LDCs are going for free trade with the developed nations with their specialization in primary product producing items, then there will be a long-term decline in terms of trade, and that will ultimately lead to balance of payment crisis. Then the backwash effect of Midrell, and followed by the development of underdevelopment theory of dependency theory that was propounded by Baran and Frank, and later on the Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange. All of them tried to establish the fact that if the less developed nations they try to prosper, then free trade is not the option. They should go for protectionist trade, and obviously they should implement different types of restrictionist trade policies like tariff, quotas, etc. As a result, from 1950s to 1970s, India's industrialization strategy was very much an inward-looking approach, and it was based on the import substitution type industrialization strategy, where imports have been tried to be substituted by producing it domestically. Now, it should be mentioned in this connection that throughout these 20 years of experience of import substitution type industrialization strategy, what was found that these strategies were very much costly to administer and economically inefficient as well. Even though the industrial production in India was slowed down after 1960s, mid-1960s, it continued up to 1980s. Sometimes we call it the industrial stagnation in the Indian economy. Some sort of progress has been made in terms of diversification of Indian industries. For example, if we look at the weight of capital goods within the index of industrial production, then it rose from 4.7% in 1956 to about 12% in 1960s, and then it further rose to about 15.3% in 1970s. Now, the weight of the basic goods, that includes the heavy chemicals, fertilizers, basic metals and cements, that also increased from about 22.3% in 1956 to about 39.4% in 1980s. And if you come to the consumer goods industries, then its share actually declined from about 48.4% in 1956 to about 24% during 1980s. Now, at this time, what I am talking about after 1980s, several incidents also occurred. Some development occurred in the world economy as well, and that again started to affect the industrial policy formulation of the Indian economy. Now, here I can mention three important events at that time. From beginning of the 1980s, many developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa who were actually implemented the import substitution type industrialization strategy, they started to liberalize their trade regime and followed the export promotion type strategy, outward orientation strategies. And that was been actually, they got the impetus from the Southeast Asian tigers, the four important nations like Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore. They actually experienced a miracle growth rate by following an outward export promotion or export-led type strategy formulations. and that actually influenced the world economy. The third important event that occurred at that time was the Third World Debt Crisis in 1982. Actually, during 1973-74, the OPEC nations raised the price of petroleum and by limiting its supply in the world market. And with the rise in the price of petrol, these particular nations, they earned a huge amount of profit that they deposited in some Western commercial banks. Now, these Western commercial banks found these less developed nations, particularly some Latin American nations, as a soft option to give loans to those nations. But in 1982, what actually came forward is that first Mexico announced that they are not in a position to repay the loan back, and then many other poor, less developed nations also started to show their inability to repay the loan back. And as a result, they bank upon the IMF and World Bank to bail out from this situation. And at that time, the policy prescriptions from the IMF was to follow the structural adjustment policies. So these are the three important developments that occurred during this time in 1980s. Now, in the late 80s and start of 90s, there was the Gulf War. And during the Gulf War, the price of petroleum again rose to a significant extent. And India, being the major importer of petroleum from the rest of the world, this impacted India very adversely. The import bill of India rose to such a high extent that the foreign exchange reserve that India had at that time were barely sufficient to cover only 15 days of import. So to tackle the situation, India resorted to IMF for the help, and the IMF actually prescribed India to go for structural adjustment and macroeconomic reforms. So from 1991 onwards, India actually went through a phase of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And in that situation, from 1990 onwards, India implemented various types of reforms, not only in case of agriculture, industry, trade, commerce, taxation, etc. And in 1991, India implemented the new industrial policy that substantially deregulated the economy. Now, this new industrial policy actually opened up the sectors, the industrial sectors for the private participants. It actually dismantled the industrial licensing policy, and it opened up the sector which were previously reserved for the public sector, except for some strategic concerns. There was an amendment in the MRTP Act, and foreign technology and foreign investment was allowed into the Indian industries. And that gives an impetus to Indian industries to thrive and also to diversify. Now, basically, if you look at this slide, then you can easily see that from 1960s to 1990s, if we look at the manufacturing production in terms of the growth rate of manufacturing sector, not only the registered manufacturing sectors, but also the unregistered manufacturing sector, then you can see both the manufacturing sector, the registered manufacturing and unregistered manufacturing, both have showed a positive growth rate. Now, after 1995-96, the Indian economy again experiences sort of deceleration in the manufacturing performance. And during 1980s and 90s, the chemical and related industries increased in their relative importance and emerged as India's leading value-adding sector. And on the other hand, there was a decline in the share of total value added, but they continued to be the largest source of employment along with the food sector. Now, with the opening up of the economy and with the inflow of foreign capital, foreign technology, India's industrial structure started to diversify a bit more. Now, one important observation that we find during 1990s to 2013 is that there was a spectacular growth of the service sector in Indian economy, and as a result, in the industrial, in the manufacturing production or manufacturing share in the export started to decline, but that of services or service-related goods were started to increase at that time. Now, there were different reasons why that actually occurred at that time. We can mention a few of them. Firstly, there was a growth of the disposable income of the Indian middle class, and we all know that with the increase in income, the demand actually shifts from some agricultural goods to manufacturing and then to service related goods. So the demand for service sector related products increased due to this factor. There was also some real estate boom, increase in the retail business at that time. There was a growth of the IT sector, tremendous growth at that time. The boom in the banking and the insurance sector. There was also the growth of the entertainment industry. So all of these actually contributed to a spectacular growth of the service sector during this particular time, and the export basket also been diversified a lot. If we look at the export basket from the traditional items like tea, coffee, leather items, food items, spices, etc., the new export basket started to compose of computer software, gems and jewelry, ready-made garments, flowers, and meat, etc. So the basket also started to get diversified over the substantial period of time. Now, if we look at the diversification of Indian industry since the inception of planning, and if we look after 2013, the 2015-16 and 2016-17, you can see in this slide that starting from the IIP general to mining, manufacturing, electricity, and then on, if you go to the use-based classification, then you can also see that the primary goods, capital goods, intermediate goods, from the construction to the infrastructural goods, as well as the consumer durables and non-durables. In all aspects, you can see a spectacular growth in 2016-17 compared to 2015-16 with the base year 2011-12. Now, another important aspect that have to be mentioned in this connection is that for any nation, if the industrial structure has to flourish, then there should be a sort of enterprise creation. This activity should be promoted. And accordingly, the government of India started the campaign of Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the Vocal for Local. All these initiatives are actually critical for the development of entrepreneurship within the nation. Now, in this connection, I just want to mention that the role of small scale and small, medium, and medium size and micro industries are very critical for the development of industrial structure of an economy, and also for the diversification of the industrial structure, particularly in the context of Indian economy. Because of the fact that firstly, the micro, medium, and small scale industries, they contribute about 8% of our country's GDP, and about 45% of the manufacturing output, about 40% of our export, and this has enormous potential for self-employment. Moreover, these industries and productions are import light. It requires less amount of capital, and obviously we have the expertise in production of these small scale and cottage industries from the very beginning, even before our independence. Now, for these industries to flourish, very recently government has taken many initiatives. The major problem though that those industries actually face relates to their funds, obviously the infrastructural constraints and marketing of their products. So what government has tried to do, that government has trying to promote these businesses of MSMEs in terms of the financial support, skill and technological upgradation, provision of relevant information to them, and obviously to help them to market their products in a better way. The other initiative that is also important to mention in this connection is the startups. These startups are also the sort of industries or the entrepreneurial potentials that has the potential, but the problem is without the lack of support or the ambience, they fail in most of the instances. So the major objective of this startup initiative in India was to become a nation of job creators rather than the nation of job seekers. And as a result, the growth of startup can also create diverse business opportunities. Now we all know that India has enormous, commercial potential for the startups, having the population size of about 1.3 billion. And from 1990s, Indian economy has been liberalized to a substantial extent. So, in all this respect, India has been referred to as the poster child of emerging markets. And if these potentials have been properly reaped, then obviously India can thrive in terms of the startups, and it has a tremendous business prospect and a tremendous scope for industrial diversification.